Hey everybody, and welcome to This Week in Point North. I guess this is a new show that I'm going to do every Monday morning right here. Excuse me while my phone buzzes. It's Monday morning. I am not ready for any of this, I promise. But this week, we are going to discuss a number of things on Point North Media, and I wanted to take this opportunity to talk to you all about it, to say hey on this fine Monday morning, to kind of warm ourselves up for the week ahead, to talk about the schedule, to probably take a couple questions, maybe be here for 20 minutes, something like that. But, you know, just a little informal hangout, I suppose. I'm still obviously recovering from my sick week. My voice isn't still quite back to where I've forgotten how to podcast because my energy is not perhaps where it should be for first thing on a Monday morning, but everything is fine. We are dealing in dire times though, my friends, because as I sat down to record this session, to go live with this session, my coffee grinder broke. It is a tough day here in Oklahoma City. So obviously I'm going to need to run it to Target at some point today and replace that thing. If you have recommendations for fine coffee grinders, get in touch and let me know. I will have to buy one from Target just as a stopgap measure, but that's, you know, more of a keeping mind and soul and body together thing than, you know, any kind of aesthetic statement on what I prefer for my coffee grinder. This week, we have a really busy week. Actually, we have a really busy week here on Point North. This evening, I am giving my my Watching Our Stories History of Television class, which was delayed from last week because I was sick. Tomorrow, we have the final session in Season 3 of Dear Mr. Potter, the final Prisoner of Azkaban session, in which we're going to talk about the movie, in which we're going to talk about the adaptive choices to a certain extent. We kind of already covered a lot of the adaptive choices back when we did the live commentary track for Prisoner of Azkaban. So instead, what I want to do is kind of the movie as a version of the book conversation that I look at the movie of Prisoner of Azkaban as a complete story. How does it work? How does it function, narratively speaking, dynamically speaking? How does it work if you come to that story fresh? Because, of course, I think that has been a legitimate criticism, certainly a criticism that I have had of the first two Harry Potter movies, and the fact that they don't really work on their own terms. But Prisoner does. But interestingly, Azkaban does, the movie version of Azkaban does work on its own terms in a slightly different way than the book version of Azkaban works on its own terms, if that makes sense. So we're going to talk about that on Tuesday and do a little Q&A too. I should say that the Watching Our Stories History of Television class is at 9 p.m. this evening. I guess the registration page is still open. So if you want to head on over to pointnorthmedia.com/classes, you could probably register now before I take that button down in about an hour, I guess. On Tuesday, we're doing Dear Mr. Potter at 10 p.m. Eastern. Then on Wednesday, also at 10 p.m. Eastern, we have a Point North one-shot. It's been a little while. The last Point North one-shot I did, I guess, was Ready Player One, which was a while ago now. So I'm glad to be diving back into the one-shots this week. The Mummy from 1999, a suggestion, I believe, a recommendation, a request, I guess, from our very own Susa Sundari here today. So okay, Fina's asking, when do we talk about the Azkaban movie? Tomorrow night, 10 p.m. Eastern, tomorrow evening. All of this information will be available on pointnorthmedia.com, I should say. I suppose this would have been a good intro to. But one of the things that I'm going to do with this little live video is embed it every Monday morning over on pointnorthmedia.com so that anyone who comes to the site can get a video version, an text version of the latest schedule updates along with links to the calendar. So that's going to be a regular feature over on Point North. And as I say, we'll hang out here every Monday morning for 20 minutes, 30 minutes, something like that. I will normally have coffee. I don't today. It's very sad. So on Wednesday at 10 p.m. Eastern, we're going to talk about The Mummy from 1999. Brendan Fraser, John Hannah. It's a knockout movie. It's also a much smarter movie, I think, than it appears to be, because while it is paying homage to kind of 80s treasure hunt movies, right? There's a strain of films in the very late 1970s and then 1980s of weird kind of high concept, somewhat supernaturally inflected treasure hunt movies. These are perhaps best represented by the Indiana Jones movies, though even that is kind of off on the side a little bit. But like Indiana Jones, The Mummy references this resolutely pulp tradition, right? It's a pulp 1940s dime store paperback kind of story, but it demonstrates an understanding of that, which is surprisingly sophisticated, as well as being just a really well-constructed, well-conceived, well-orchestrated movie. I like The Mummy from 1999 a lot, so we're going to talk about that on Wednesday night, also 10 p.m. Eastern. As I say, all of these times are available now. If you head on over to pointnorthmedia.com, click the podcast button, you'll see the calendar there. You can subscribe to that calendar, or there will be a post going up at pointnorthmedia.com pretty soon, or you can subscribe to the newsletter. If you've subscribed to the newsletter, then you already know everything I'm going to say, which is going to be pretty fun. On Thursday at 3 p.m. Eastern, an afternoon session on Thursday for There and Back Again 39, Fire and Deep Water, which is our discussion primarily of Chapter 5 of Book 3 of The Lord of the Rings. Primarily, we're going to be talking about the White Rider, but we're also going to be concluding our discussion on Ents and Entwives because, well, we just didn't get through all of that material. So that's going to be a pretty crowded session of There and Back Again, but I can't wait. The reason that we're having an afternoon session of There and Back Again is so that on Thursday evening, I can do my duty to my fellow co-hosts over at the Excelsior podcast and go see Justice League. I'm going to go and see Justice League opening night. I'm still optimistic. I'm still hopeful that this is going to be a good movie. If you haven't heard the Excelsior podcast, you can find that over at commonroomradio.com. We just discussed, actually today, there's an episode on the first volume of the comic book Faith from Valiant Comics is going up. Really fun book, really great discussion. I really enjoyed that episode. But last week we talked about Thor Ragnarok, which was just a surprising delight, just a surprising delight. I was so thrilled that we got something that is so atonal for much of the mainstream MCU, the Marvel Cinematic Universe. I was so thrilled that we got what is, in effect, an outright comedy. It worked beautifully. So you can hear my thoughts on that over on Excelsior. Head on over to commonroomradio.com and listen to that show. But next week, we have our thoughts on the Justice League coming up. So I'm going to go and see Justice League Thursday night and then again Friday morning with my co-hosts Vinton and Sarah. I'm going to prep all the notes for that show. I'm going to run that show. So that's going to be really fun. We'll record that Friday afternoon as we usually do. And then Friday evening at 10 p.m. Eastern, we are going to have a kind of a final wrap discussion on The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. We're theoretically going to talk about the 2005 movie, but I have to tell you guys, I just watched the 2005 movie again while I was sick, and I just don't know how much I have to say about that film. It's not terrible. The worst thing I think that you can say about that movie is that it's just desperately uninspired. So I probably won't have that much to say about that, but we will take some general Q&A, and then we are going to announce our next book club text and the schedule for that book club text. You guys have been fantastic over on the Patreon page. If you're a Patreon supporter at patreon.com/pointnorthmedia, then you can vote on the next Patreon exclusive book club book. And that process has been really interesting. And the winner is a little surprising. And I'm really, really eager to, I don't know why I'm playing it so close to my chest. You guys can head on over to the Patreon page and find out. The next book that we're discussing in the book club is Murder on the Orient Express by Agatha Christie. We are definitely going to talk about the novel, and we will definitely talk about the new adaptation. I think this is a great opportunity to go see the new movie and talk about that. And we may talk about the 74 adaptation too, which is a movie that I grew up watching incessantly and love a great deal. So we may talk about that if we have time to do that too. So that's the next Point North Book Club book, Murder on the Orient Express, by the incomparable, by the you cannot overuse, superlatives to describe this woman, by the legendary Agatha Christie. The more I read about Agatha Christie's life and the more I appreciate her contribution to, to mystery fiction, certainly, to crime fiction, certainly, to mainstream fiction, certainly, to British fiction, certainly. I mean, the more I read and think and talk about Agatha Christie, the more enamored I am of her. It's a remarkable life and a remarkable career, of course, too. Good. Princess Ostrich says, this is my favorite Christie book. Excellent. Excellent. Yes. Good. We're quoting some Thor Ragnarok. Yes. Good. Good. And restraining from some spoilers, so that's very good, too. I'm glad to see that. Oh, Princess Ostrich says, I can never catch the afternoon Lord of the Rings seminars, only the 4 a.m. one, darn time zones, excuse me. And Lord of the Rings is my favorite of the seminars. I know, I apologize. I do try and move them around so that people can make them. We're going to have some very happy people in Britain who can make the 3 p.m. Eastern one on Thursday, but I know it is frustrating. There's just, a restraint here. There's a constraint placed upon us thanks to irresponsible time zones. Hashtag irresponsible time zones, right? Good. And Kate says, I'm missing Hitchhikers, but hopefully I can make Agatha. Oh, I'm so glad. I hope so. Yes. Good. Oh, and both Kate and Becca are showing some love for Excelsior. That's wonderful, guys. Thanks so much. The Excelsior show is really fun. It is basically a kind of comics podcast in the broadest possible sense, in that we talk about comic books, but we also talk about movie adaptations and TV adaptations and original stories and all kinds of things. We have a we're kind of pushing between the big budget stuff. You know, we've talked about Wonder Woman, and we've talked about Spider-Man Homecoming, and we talked about Thor Ragnarok, and we're going to talk about Justice League. But we also spend an equal amount of time, I think, delving into pretty unusual and underrepresented books, honestly. So that's always pretty good. So I urge you to go and check that out. It's a pretty fun show, available in about, 2 hours, I guess, is pretty much where we are. We just also did Bat Month, a month of shows about Batman, where we discussed Lego Batman, Batman the Long Halloween, the comic book, Batman from 1989, the Tim Burton Batman, and then Batman Returns, the 1992 sequel to the 1989 Batman Tim Burton movie. So all of those pretty fun conversations. Batman Returns, amazing. Batman Returns is an incredible film. Not perfect by any means, and certainly some of the sexual politics haven't dated particularly well, you guys, but it is a visually stunning, surprisingly ambitious film, anchored with this absolute knockout performance from Michelle Pfeiffer as Selena Kyle / Catwoman. Just fantastic performance. So I urge you, if you haven't seen the Tim Burton Batman movies recently, go back, watch Batman 89, watch Batman Returns from 1992, and then go head on over to commonroomradio.com and listen to Excelsior. It's a pretty good show. Let's see. Do you guys have any questions before we can wrap up? Oh, Leo is asking, did you switch to standard time last weekend? Yes, here in Oklahoma. Yes, I still vaguely understand how daylight saving works across this fine land. It should automatically correct. I just realized that I sent out this week's newsletter. Is this why you're asking, Leo? I sent out this week's newsletter in Eastern Daylight Time, and I didn't mean Eastern Daylight Time, did I? I meant Eastern Standard Time. Time zones suck, you guys. Time zones are terrible and the worst, and you know, we try and work around that as best we can. Yes, I guess the calendar version will have updated properly. So whatever it says on the calendar, you can go by that. So whatever revised version of the schedule is available over there, that will work in your time zone. You can automatically translate that time zone. The calendar also, by the way, it's a Google Calendar that I run for the Point North Live broadcast schedule. It also contains links to each of the Crowdcast pages, so you can just go to the calendar and link directly out to the Crowdcast pages for the individual sessions, which should work. Yes, get rid of daylight saving, says Kate. I could not agree more. My goodness. Let me see here. Yes, a lot of time zone chat here. Time zones are just, yes. Whew, boy. Pretty terrible, actually, pretty terrible. So that, I think, is going to do it. As I say, so we've got our Watching Our Stories History of Television class tonight for people who have registered for that class. If you still want to register, you probably have about another hour heading over to pointnorthmedia.com/classes. Tuesday, 10 p.m. Eastern, Dear Mr. Potter 312, the 12th and final episode of our third season, More Punch, is the name that I have given to this session, in which we talk about the Prisoner of Azkaban movie adaptation, less as an adaptation and more as a story. On Wednesday at 10 p.m. Eastern again, we have a Point North one-shot on The Mummy from 1999, which I cannot wait to talk about. That is such an enthusiastic, dumb, brilliant movie that I just adore. On Thursday, 3 p.m. Eastern, an afternoon session for There and Back Again. 3 p.m. Eastern, 2 p.m. Central, There and Back Again 39. That's Fire and Deep Water with the White Rider, the return of a familiar figure, which isn't a spoiler for literally anyone in the world, and yet I'm maintaining this pretense that some people might be spoiled by it, so I'm not going to talk about it. But yes, Fire and Deep Water will conclude our discussion of Ents. It will conclude Chapter 4 and bring us up to the arboreal march to Isengard, the coming of Burnham Wood to Dunsinane. If you listened to last week's session, that was a huge point of inspiration for Tolkien himself. And then we'll move into the coming of the White Rider. And then on Friday at 10 p.m. Eastern, the final book club discussion for Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy and some general Q&A. And maybe I'll tell you guys how to make a perfect Manhattan. Maybe that's what I'll do. I have all the ingredients here. I could make a perfect Manhattan live on air. Probably not right now. Probably not at 10 o'clock here in Oklahoma City on a Monday morning. Probably that's not wise. But maybe 10 p.m. on a Friday evening. sounds a little more wise, honestly. It sounds a little more inevitable. I think that's pretty much where we are. Yes. Oh, yes. Lynn is asking, are we starting with Wizard of Earthsea? Yes, we are starting with Wizard of Earthsea. Basically, I'm looking at Wizard of Earthsea right now. I'm actually about 2/3 of the way through a read of A Wizard of Earthsea. For those of you who haven't kept up, we're going to take brief diversions from Harry Potter as a part of Dear Mr. Potter. So before we move on to Goblet of Fire, we're going to take a breath from J.K. Rowling's world and look at one of the books which has inspired, even indirectly, J.K. Rowling's work, or ultimately one of the books which has been inspired by her work. And the first book that we're going to look at in that context is Ursula K. Le Guin's classic fantasy, A Wizard of Earthsea. Hey, it's about a boy who discovers that he might be a wizard, and he goes to wizarding school, and then bad things happen. So, you know, kind of J.K. Rowling adjacent, at least. It is a magnificent book. It's also a quick read. I am right now trying to figure out if we're going to do it in 5 sessions. I'm kind of leaning toward 5. I think that's probably the way that we're going to go. So we'll do 5 weeks of A Wizard of Earthsea, which will pretty much, I guess, when you factor in, you know, holidays and such, like, pretty much take us up to the end of the year. I mean, we're here in the middle of November right now. So by the time we have this week's wrap-up discussion for Dear Mr. Potter, and then move into Wizard of Earthsea for 5 weeks, pretty much we'll be starting Goblet of Fire around the beginning of January. So I'm very excited for that. Goblet of Fire, a really fascinating book. I mean, hey, good news, you guys. All the rest of the Harry Potter books are pretty good. I mean, I know Prisoner of Azkaban is my favorite, but I'm eager to talk about all the remaining books in the series. Each one has its own particular combination of strengths and intentions. We've kind of moved past the point where we're doing, you know, boarding school adventures for Harry at this point. So by the time we hit, and arguably, as I've discussed in the season of Dear Mr. Potter, this has already happened in the pages of Prisoner of Azkaban. But certainly by the time we get into Goblet of Fire, we're doing something much more intentional. We're doing something much more purposeful. And I'm really eager to talk about that. So yes, we're going to wrap up Azkaban this week. Then 5 weeks, probably adjusting for holidays, on A Wizard of Earthsea. And then we will start Goblet of Fire. And then after Goblet of Fire, well, there are a few possibilities that I'm looking at. It would be really interesting to do, I'm looking at Lev Grossman's The Magicians. I'm looking at the Rick Riordan books, I think, have a certain overlap there. I'm actually really interested in, and you guys can tell me what you think of this, I'm really interested in delving into one of the classic British boarding school adventures that I've discussed. You know, I think it would be really interesting to talk about, well, not necessarily boarding school adventures, but juvenile adventures in that, you know, quintessential British tradition. I can talk about Just William, or I can talk about St. Trinian's, or I can talk about, you know, The Famous Five or The Secret Seven. I can talk about, you know, one of these novels for particularly those American readers, I think, who perhaps haven't been quite as charmed, or at least who aren't quite as familiar with that kind of storytelling. I think it'd be really interesting to kind of fold that in and lean away from the fantasy aspect of Harry Potter and more to the Bildungsroman, you know, coming of age boarding school adventure version of that story. So that's going to happen too. Oh, I should also say that if you haven't yet, head on over to Point North Media and click the registration button for the newsletter. It's right there on the front page. You can just fill in your information there and sign up for the newsletter, because there will be an announcement of a new class coming out Thursday or Friday of this week, I think, and it is a long-awaited class. So if you have been pestering me to do a class for a while, and this is a pretty major kind of probably going to run 4-week class. I'm still finalizing the schedule here. But if you've been pestering me to do a class, if you've been asking me to do a class for a while, go subscribe to the newsletter, because you'll get the first announcement and an early bird registration deal, I guess. That's going to happen later this week. So a little minor hint there for you. Let me see. Oh, we got some more books. Agatha Witch by Nenny Okorafor. Okorafor, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, is amazing and has such interesting parallels with HP. Great. Yeah, The Famous Five, says Lynn. That brings back memories. Yes. And Aaron's, Fina loved The Famous Five. That's great. And Leo says, never heard of any of those. That's exactly it, right? There's a whole literary tradition, like a mid-century literary tradition in the UK of juvenile fiction that traveled a little bit. I mean, the colonies and the territories certainly had their copies, but it didn't really hit here in the United States. So I guess the American version of this that kind of had more success crossing the Atlantic to Britain, but still didn't quite penetrate the market there. The Hardy Boys and Nancy Drew, right? American kids by my understanding, grew up reading Hardy Boys and Nancy Drew, certainly in that mid-century period. And the British version of that is the kind of boarding school adventure story. So we'll definitely be talking about that at some point. I think I've just convinced myself that that's going to be a future title that we'll look at there. That's going to be really fun. I was a big fan of The Secret Seven. The Secret Seven was even more juvenile. The Secret Seven were, gosh, maybe like 6, 7, 8 years old. They were very, very young and generally solved very low-key mysteries around the neighborhood. They had a shed and a secret handshake and a knock and things like that, and it was pretty cool. So I was a big fan of that when I was a kid, and then I graduated up into the Famous Five, who basically dealt with gypsies and smugglers. Hey, you guys, maybe not the best, the best ethnic and racial sensitivity from mid-century British juvenile fiction, but still, nonetheless, entertaining books. Yes, we'll talk about some of this. Good. Oh, Leo's confirming. That's great. Hardy Boys and Nancy Drew. Yes, good. I did love, actually, Hardy Boys when I was growing up. I lived for a while in Germany, right next to an American airbase that would stock, both in their library and in their store, would stock volume after volume of the Hardy Boys. I think there was a while there where I had read all of the Hardy Boys books. That certainly isn't true anymore, but there were later renaissance there, I think. Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, says Aaron. I've got to tell you, that's been on the list for so long now. That is one of those books. Yes, I will definitely talk about Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. I will definitely talk about The Time Traveler's Wife. I will definitely talk about, what are the other ones? Avatar: The Last Airbender is apparently definitely going to happen at some point. There are certain texts now that I've been talking about for so long and talking around for so long that they have kind of graduated up. Stormfront by Jim Butcher, the first of the Dresden Files. That's definitely going to be talked about at some point. I think what I'll do in 2019, I'll maybe just do like a greatest hits session for the Point North Book Club that instead of opening it up to public votes, it's just going to be, no, you guys have already voted on this. These were consistently the second and third choices in every poll that I've run for the last 3 years. So we'll see how that works out. Good. Let me see. Oh, Becca's recommending, Michael was talking about Jane Eyre. Yes. Closest thing to a boarding school adventure I've read. Actually, Jane Eyre, not dissimilar, Michael. That's a really good pull. Not dissimilar at all. And Becca is recommending the excellent Can I Just Say podcast run by Daphne Olive and Elizabeth Stevens, recorded at least in part in this very studio. They just released their first episode talking about Jane Eyre. They're going to record another episode talking about the adaptations of Jane Eyre. It is a very smart, very engaging, absolutely brilliant podcast. I love both of them. They are my favorite podcasters. They are extraordinarily good and subtle and thoughtful and also funny and charismatic and engaging. They're just great. You can find that too over at Common Room Radio. That's Can I Just Say is the name of that podcast. Yes. Yes. I can find the, I don't actually remember what it was that they called the episode. Let me see. I can find it though, and I can paste it. Yes, Can I Just Say, episode number 5 on Jane Eyre is available there. You can also find that on iTunes. If I can persuade this website to load, then I might be able to paste a link into the chat here. But you know what? It just doesn't quite. Oh, there it is. Okay. Can I paste that? Does that work? I think that works. That's so great. That's great. Okay. Michael's also saying Dresden's voice in the first few books is so strong. Yes, right? The way that the Dresden Files comes out swinging, the way that Jim Butcher's sense of his world just is so immediate and so vibrant and absolutely incomplete, right? The version that we get of Butcher's, for those of you who haven't read Jim Butcher's Dresden Files series, it is a fantasy / magical realist noir series set in Chicago. It is a, down on his luck private detective who happens to be a wizard. And it's very, very strong right off the bat. The world building is nothing like as developed as it will be later. It has an arc. I've oftentimes described Jim Butcher's Dresden Files series as being one of the most televisual series of novels that I've ever encountered or ever engaged with. The way that it is, of course, common for any series of novels to expand. You add more elements to the world building. You introduce new characters, new locations, and new principles, new underlying conceits and metaphors so that you can, expand out and keep telling stories in this space. But there is a very distinct and idiosyncratic way that those elements are introduced season after season of television. And that, I think, is echoed rather beautifully in the Dresden Files. Reading the Dresden Files, at least the experience of reading the first, I don't know, 5 or 6 books in the series, which I think is about as far as I've gotten, is very much like watching Supernatural. If you guys are a fan of Supernatural, you should definitely read the Dresden Files. Don't watch the Dresden Files. It's pretty bad. Yes, good. Good. All right. Let's wrap it up there, you guys. That's been 25 minutes. I think that's going to do it for this Monday morning. As I say, all of this information will be available over on the calendar. All of this information will be available over on pointnorthmedia.com. Thank you for joining me for this ramshackle first episode. I still don't really know what this show is going to be. If you have suggestions for what you would like this show to be, this little Monday morning, hey, let's get together and talk about the week, we can definitely, adapt this idea. We can definitely expand this idea, and this might be a great place for me to talk about some things that I wouldn't ordinarily get the chance to talk about. I just watched Atomic Blonde, you guys. I'm never going to have the chance to talk about Atomic Blonde on a podcast, but I just watched Atomic Blonde, and I liked very much one of the movies that movie tried to be. It takes a weird turn toward the end of the second act into the third act, but then resets itself at the end. When it is a high-octane comic book James Bond movie, I am super in. When it is a high-octane grimdark comic book Jason Bourne movie, I am much less in. And crashing those two things into each other, odd choice. But anyway, that's Atomic Blonde. Kind of if you're a fan of very stupid James Bond movies, if you're a fan of... The point of comparison that I actually came to was like the Brosnan era James Bond movies. If you're a fan of Pierce Brosnan as James Bond, you will definitely love Atomic Blonde. If you're a fan of Daniel Craig as James Bond, you will love like the middle stretch of Atomic Blonde, but you will probably hate the beginning and the end. So that's pretty much where we are. Atomic Blonde, pretty fun. Can't recommend that. Unanimously can't recommend it without exception, without hesitation. It is a qualified recommendation, but yes, well worth checking out. All right, that's going to do it. You guys have a great day. Have a great week. I will see you through the week for various live broadcasts, and of course, the podcast will be available after the fact. I will talk to you all again very soon. Until then, take care and have a great Monday.